Then Naomi took the child and put him on her bosom and became his nurse. The neighbor woman gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, and Hezron became the father of Ram. And Ram became the father of Abinadab. And Abinadab became the father of Nasham. And Nasham became the father of Salem. And Salem became the father of Boaz. And Boaz became the father of Obed. And Obed became the father of Jesse. And Jesse became the father of David. Those are the last few verses of the book of Ruth. Welcome to another episode of Theologic. I'm Zach Deacon.
I'm Zach Packey.
Sean Mushton.
I finished up with Judges kind of devotionally, slowly-ish, reading through it. And the next book in line for those just kind of reading in step through the Old Testament, if you want to call it that, is Ruth. And so these guys let me pick the topics. And so guess what I picked? I picked Ruth.
Yeah.
And I will go back to Joel that they made fun of me for at first, and then it became a really, really good episode. We talked about the book of Joel. It was great conversation. Go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. Now we're going to do the same thing with Ruth. 4 chapters, small book in the Old Testament, pretty impactful, lot to discuss. And we're just going to do a flyover of Ruth. And those last few verses of Ruth are pretty important as they just lay out the genealogy that goes straight to David, and David ultimately a king, and the precursor, if you want to call it. What's the technical word for that? The shadow, or the
shadow.
The shadow of Christ in the Old Testament, if you want to call it that. There's many shadows per se, but David
or the type. Maybe.
Yeah, the type. Yeah, thank you. So. Yeah, that's Ruth, guys. I hope you enjoy our conversation around Ruth. I hadn't read Ruth in a while, honestly, if I'm going to be honest about it. And so I hope that anybody listening in who hasn't read Ruth in a while goes and reads Ruth.
So my question to you, because you read many books of the Bible, when you got to Ruth, why were you like, oh, this is one I want to hear out on Theologic? What was it about Ruth that you're like, I like this?
So I read through it, and I share my raw, honest thoughts, because if there's other people feeling this way out there, then I want you to continue to listen to us. I read through it and I'm like, okay, Lord, what's the point? And I had read through Ruth before, but I don't know. I'm just very thankful, and I say this in a humble way. Like, I'm very thankful that the Lord sanctifies us and matures us as we get older and we grow, and He grows in us. And the last time I read Ruth was probably when I was less mature and just in a different stage of life. And so now I'm coming to Ruth again, and I'm like, okay, Lord, like, what? This is your inspired word. This is in your word, and I'm supposed to take this as gospel truth. And so what does Ruth have to say for me? And what is this? How is this in the story? How does this fit in the story of redemption?
Sounds good.
Love that question.
Maybe we could do is just get a general flyby, maybe for people that are maybe not as connected or not familiar with the story of Ruth. I just put it together in like 6 quick points as we get this flyby. So from chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, you have the departure and tragedy of Elimelech's family, where you have Naomi and her husband Elimelech, along with her 2 sons, named Mahlon and Chilion. Interesting names. I think the Holy Spirit has some very interesting pictures in the names as well. You have Mahlon and Chilion, which means sickly and pining. You have Elimelech, which means my God is king. And then you have Naomi, which means pleasant. And you see some issues there. But what happens is Mahlon and Chilion, and Elimelech's family, rather, they leave the land because of a famine. They move over to Moab, and the children of Naomi and Elimelech end up getting married to 2 women, one named Orpah and one named Ruth, and then all the men die. And that's the sad part, is the part a difficulty in a famine, and then as they leave the land itself, then the men who would take care of these women in that day, which was pretty significant, you needed men in that day,
We need men today.
And we need men today, but you needed men in a different way back then, right?
I know what you mean.
Yeah, definitely. They ended up losing.
We're feminists here at Theologic.
That's right. I ain't need no man.
We also like to have fun, so I hope you like having fun with us.
Right.
What do you think,
You either just had fun and laughed with us, or you just got offended.
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
or you're never listening to us again, in which case,
sorry.
we're not sorry.
Not sorry.
Just to pause real quick, what do you think that because this is something that I just didn't really take into account until I was rereading it this morning in preparation, what is the significance, or isn't there one necessarily, that Ruth was a Moabite? She was an outsider.
Yeah. I guess I would say, if we're looking at the theological implications, or at least in determining the character of God, we note another instance where you have God's love for Gentiles. I mean, I think that's part of the picture. He includes Gentile women in the line of the Messiah, and very explicitly stated later on in the book of Matthew, and I think also in Luke. You have Boaz, and you also have Ruth, as well as Rahab, being connected to the line of the Messiah. So you kind of see that, I think, as an important theological implication. I don't know. What do you think, Sean? Any other thoughts on that?
I guess some more thoughts on that topic once you've done your flyover there. But one thing on the topic, although this is general, not so much about Ruth herself, but I think that one thing that is very important at the beginning of the narrative, just the first verse, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife had 2 sons. That is not a good move, going to Moab. There's famine, and so what we see here is there's not a faith that God will provide. We're leaving the land that God has given to us, this place that God has said he would bless. Now, right now we're in famine, but we're supposed to stay here. They leave, and where do they go? It's not just they go to some random country, but Moab is one of their enemies. And I'll mention more about that later, but just from the first verse, we should understand that this is not going good places. Ruth does not start a nice sunny day, and they're out doing their thing. No, it's a dark time. Very dark.
And I'm not condoning, I would agree with you, so this isn't a point to disagree, but I'm just wondering, too, if not to look into those few verses, because that's actually a point I never thought about. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But as I literally just got done reading Judges and thinking about the landscape of what's going on in Judges, do you think that it could have been 2 things, both probably a sinful attitude and heart? 1, what you just said, or 2, that it's so bad. It's so bad where they're at that there's just no way. The leadership, consistently in Judges, the leadership is horrible. Yeah. It's everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, and so now they have a famine, and they're like, okay, well, yeah, famine is bad, but these, nothing good's going to happen here. Yeah, and so.
Understanding the wickedness of the time of Judges, it makes sense why God would bring famine, bring some sort of correction and judgment for the people in that day. So yeah, I mean, I think it's both. It is that bad, and I think what Sean brings out is it's out of the frying pan into the fire, right? You got terrible situation over here, an even worse situation over there where they're about to go. And and as Sean brings out, there's a demonstration of a lack of faith, and they sort of reap what they sow. So then you have the return and misery of Naomi and Ruth. They come back, and this is where the name significance comes back in again, because people, and it's interesting, you see God's kindness to Naomi when she comes back, because everybody's excited to see her. And then when she comes back into the land, everybody's like, hey, Naomi, and her name means pleasant. And now she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because I went out full and I came back bitter, right? She came back empty. And then you have Ruth standing right next to her, and it's like, yeah, what am I, nothing? You do have Ruth. You have a woman who has just demonstrated her absolute beautiful loyalty to you, somebody who is not blood family. Even though she's a Moabitess, she's not Jewish, and she's kind of missing out. She's missing out on all the blessings that God has brought her already, and she's about to get more, interestingly. And so,
well, it's interesting too. Could we note that Ruth was a pagan.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than go along with her other sister-in-law,
Yeah.
she says, no, I'm going to follow the one true God,
Yeah,
your God,
You're right.
and I'm going to go with you.
Yeah, and that's an important part because it's not just loyalty to Naomi, but it's loyalty to Yahweh as well. She has made the decision apart from her land and the gods of her land, which I think, does she also say to the ladies, go back to your gods as well? I mean, I could be off on that. And Ruth says, no, I'm not going to go back to my family, and I'm not going to go back to my gods. I'm sticking with you and your God. So that's, I think, one of the points that makes Ruth such a treasure. That's already there in Naomi's life, and Naomi says, I've come back empty and I don't have anything, which in a sense is true, but she doesn't see really the whole picture.
Yeah.
So we go from there to chapter 2, which is all about how Ruth serves in the field of one of the family members of Naomi, Boaz, and all of the service she does and the favor that continually gets shown to her from Boaz. You've got protection that comes from Boaz. You've got extra gleanings, because in the Old Testament law, if you were a widow or if you were poor, you were free to partake of gleaning, whatever the grain that fell during the harvest to take and to bring with you and take as your own food, because you're poor, you don't have the same abilities, and if you're a widow, you don't have a husband to take care of you. So, and what happens is Boaz begins to start showing her favor, not only in the protection, but also in the kind words that he speaks to her, as well as in giving the favorable spot for gleaning of the food. So,
as you're saying that, this started as a joke a moment ago, but I actually mean this in all sincerity. It's just interesting. Although I wouldn't say this is a theme of the book. I think we see something here. You keep emphasizing the need that Naomi and Ruth find themselves in, but now Boaz shows up, and things start to look better. And just a quick note, I would just say it's interesting. We were joking earlier about feminism, but it's interesting in such a comfortable, luxurious culture that we're in that feminism can develop and flourish. But the luxury of the culture that we live in is an anomaly compared to many other cultures in the world, where in this narrative, one of the true blessings is that a man steps in. And not only is that providential in the sense of this narrative in the Bible, it's also reflective of what reality has been for many places, where if there are no men, there's death, there's diminishment. But we live in a kind of a snapshot of a very unique kind of luxurious culture, where norms can be a little bit different, but across history, it's not what you see.
Not only is he a man stepping in, but he's a good man.
A good man, yes.
And he's a wealthy man. The text says that he was able to handle.
What's the particular word that's used for Boaz to describe? Is it he's a man of worth? There's a particular word that is used to describe him.
It says here, this is a Christian standard, he was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. So there you have the blood relationship to Elimelech's family, and Naomi being married into that would also benefit from that.
Yeah, the LSB says just a little differently, same concept, a mighty man of excellence. Of the family of Elimelech.
New King James says that he's a man of great wealth and of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz.
Do you think that there's a certain... This is just coming to mind now, so if this is just kind of off the reservation, then obviously shoot it down, but is Boaz kind of like maybe the male version of what? We tell jokes here. Apparently I told one and I didn't even get it.
The male...
If it's off the reservation, shoot it.
Shoot it down. Shoot it down. Hey, I ain't the governor of South Dakota.
Sorry.
Guys, it's early, okay?
Good morning.
Yeah. So I wonder if, is Boaz like the Proverbs 31 woman?
Like
he is the male version of the Proverbs 31 woman.
I think that's one of the reasons I was trying to highlight that. I think that you have some of the same kind of descriptions with valor and such, things like that. And that's why I was trying to double check. Because I think Ruth has a similar description of her character as well. That these two persons are historical figures, but they are also portrayed in the narrative in a very specific way to bring those things out.
Well, it is interesting. You've made the comment before on the arrangement of the Old Testament, the Jewish Old Testament.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's the same writings, it's just arranged differently. following Proverbs is the book of Ruth. The last,
Really?
yeah,
Really?
the last chapter of the book of Proverbs is the Proverbs 31 woman, and then you have Ruth
No kidding.
right afterwards. So
I was mistaken.
what's that?
It's not right. It does follow Proverbs, so the implications will be it's yeah. I'll double check that. I think I was mistaken when I said
Okay.
that particular placement, but it would be shortly after Proverbs
Yeah.
that Ruth would come along. So yeah.
Shortly after. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I
So-
just realized I made a mistake with that a couple months ago.
Oh, that's all right. That's right. But anyway, so we find ourselves here in chapter 2, and there is this this establishment of the relationship between Boaz and Ruth. Afterwards, he's showing her favor, and then you have the proposal of marriage after that in chapter 3, verses 1 through 18. Naomi and Ruth work together to demonstrate to Boaz, and it is basically Ruth is the one who seems to be initiating the marriage. And there's some cultural things there too. She lays down at his feet, I guess covering his feet, and I'm not quite sure all that signifies, right? There's some cultural...
There are some questions there about what exactly was going on there on the on the what do you call it, the where they do the grain, the
Threshing floor?
threshing floor.
The threshing floor, yeah. The book of Ruth is full of different cultural expressions of things that you just kind of ask that question, like, why
They didn't bat their eyelashes back then.
Right, yeah. It was a different time with different meanings. And then because Ruth, as well as Boaz, are people that are eager to follow the Old Testament law, what happens is, because of the way the law is set up, Ruth would rightfully belong, according to what's called levirate marriage. That is, that you must marry the closest kin to the... If your husband dies, you would marry the closest of kin to your husband, and there's somebody closer than Boaz. But that also includes getting the land, getting everything the husband had owned, but also includes the responsibility of taking care of the wife as well as the land and the family and so on. And so chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, you have a sort of contesting of that potential engagement of Boaz and Ruth together. And they ask somebody who's a closer kin, and to see if that's something that he would rather do. He has the freedom to marry her, and then and have the land. The guy says he'd like the land, but he doesn't want to marry Ruth. And that would, so he says, no, take care of it yourself then, Boaz, it's all on you. And so he is allowed to marry Ruth. And then you have chapter 4, verses 9 through 22, you have the marriage and blessing of Boaz and Ruth at the end there. And then you have the final genealogies that Zach read all the way at the beginning. They do get married, they do end up having kids. And the beauty of this is that these people are in the line of the Messiah, in the line of David the king, and then in the line, of course, of Jesus much later on. So
I would kind of go off of what Zach was saying a moment ago about just the placement within the original narrative or layout of the Old Testament. And the point that I want to bring out is that when we read Ruth in the original placement within the Old Testament narrative, is that it comes almost to the end of the Old Testament. Like the book of Psalms has already occurred. The book, like all the prophets have already been read. And it's interesting how this story shows us a principle that Paul talks about in Romans, where he talks about where sin abounded, grace abounded even more. And so I just wanted to share something that stood out to me. It was about 3 years ago. I was reading through the Old Testament in the Hebrew order. And as I was getting to Ruth, getting toward the end of the Old Testament in that particular order, what stood out to me is that this becomes a great story of redemption. This goes into the identity issue that Ruth had as a Moabite, where that's actually fairly significant within the narrative. And so as I was contemplating this, the following observation came to mind. And again, we think about this story in the context of the whole Old Testament. So for a moment, I want to slingshot us back to Genesis and not talk about every book of the Bible leading up to Ruth, but do a little bit of an overview here of how the Old Testament brings us to this place. We think about Abraham. Abraham is told to leave his father's house. But when he does this, he brings Lot along with him. And as they journey, they separate. Lot goes his own way. And after the whole ordeal with Sodom and Gomorrah, we find this really peculiar narrative regarding Lot and his daughters, and the narrative in which they get him drunk and they become pregnant by him. And it's from those two children, that Lot's daughters, that come the nations of Moab and Ammon. As time went on, the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would be in constant tension and even battle and war with the nations of Moab and Ammon. And we see this in Exodus 15, Numbers 21 through 25, multiple times in the book of Deuteronomy, multiple times in the book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So these books of the Old Testament show really how awful these nations were to Israel. However, what we find is that God works in Moab to give a glimpse of grace. Toward the end here of the Hebrew Old Testament, we read of this woman named Ruth, who was of Moab. And to think about this as her being a Moabite, we see that a Moabite is brought in out of Moab and brought into the people of God. She is rescued. God rescues her from her sin and redeems her to be part of his covenant people. Let me stop there for a moment to point out that in Deuteronomy, Moabites were not to be coming into the people of God. They had a very unique separation from the people of God. They were despised. Deuteronomy has a few laws regarding how Israel was to relate specifically to Moab. But secondly, we see with this Moabitess that God not only shows Ruth mercy, but makes her a part of his mission. Her great-grandson would be King David, to whom God made a covenant that was an everlasting covenant with a future king named Jesus, all coming from this family line. And so what we find is that God's plan to rescue and redeem Ruth was but a small example of his promised rescue and redemption of men and women of every nation, of tribe and language. Her background and lifestyle was not beyond grace. To put it in short, where sin increased in Genesis 19 regarding Lot and his daughters, in the story of Ruth, we see grace abounding, all the more to bring to pass the birth of a Redeemer who was more than the Redeemer of Ruth, but the Redeemer of mankind. So what Lot's daughters meant for evil, God meant for good. So that's a brief summary that he stretched all the way back to Genesis. We find where Moab began, an incestuous relationship, a just terrible situation, but yet that forms the beginning of part of the lineage that not only is Ruth involved in, not only is King David involved in, but Christ himself. And so I think it's just a great example of how what we intend for evil, God can have an intent for good. We see sin abounding, but grace abounding all the more. And we get that culmination here in the Ruth narrative, that as we come into this and we know where Ruth has come from, this redemption that God works is all the more majestic, if you will, as we see what's taking place in the background and where it's leading to the Redeemer.
Yeah, I think we can sometimes maybe be too prone to think that God's kindness only extends to the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and then all of a sudden it goes to the Gentiles. But I think throughout the Old Testament, you can see God's kindness to Gentiles. I already mentioned Rahab. I already mentioned Ruth, but you also include the time of Jonah and his kindness in showing grace to the people of Nineveh. So yeah, the Old Testament is full of that kind of kindness of God to not just one ethnic group, but through the entire nations. And it even goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, that it would be through his seed that all nations will be blessed. And that is Christ. And we see that you sort of see Ruth being joined into that place of blessing. I don't know if you had any more thoughts on the rest of the content, but we could go into the theological implications. I suppose you've already started that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I don't know. I just want to give quick thought before we dive into some theological implications, which I'm very excited to hear about, given how this conversation has gone already. Just this conversation has just been a reminder to me. Hopefully it's been a reminder to other people too, that study the Bible. Study the Bible. Like Ruth was included in the canon for a very, very important reason.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why I admit it, how I answered Sean's question initially is like, why talk about Ruth? Well, it's because I wouldn't necessarily said I didn't think I had a sinful heart towards, reading this, like, man, what's this all about, God? But it was very much like okay, so 4 chapters, Ruth.
Yeah.
sounds kind of sad, you know. But then the more I read, the more I kind of tried to slow down, and then obviously listen to you guys. Huge implications.
Yeah,
what an encouragement that God would reach out to the Gentiles, which all of us are, you know, and rescue us from ourselves.
Yeah, it's good that you bring that out, because that's one of the most important parts of Bible study, is asking not only, okay, why is this, what do we lose if we don't have this book in the canon? But that also comes with every text too. What do I lose if I don't have chapter 2 of Ruth? What do I lose if I don't have chapter 3 of Ruth? I think what that can do for us as Bible students is highlight the importance of every bit of the inspired word that the Holy Spirit inspired. So that's really important. And so this is good, I hope, for everybody to see this is what you miss if you don't have Ruth in the canon. And one of them, as already been brought out, what this book does is it provides an important link to the genealogy of David and the genealogy of Christ. If we didn't have that last little portion of the book of Ruth in chapter 4, I think we'd have a lot more questions. It's, okay, why is this included? But that last little section is one of the more important sections, and it's the genealogy, which tends to be the more boring part amongst people. That's the part where I'm more prone to, all right, if I'm going to read First Chronicles, there's like the first 10 chapters of First Chronicles, that's all genealogy, and I would be more prone to skip it. But that's actually a place of importance. It should be in there for David and for Christ.
So implication, don't skip the genealogies.
Yeah. Or if you can speed read it, or if you can find it in a diagram, that really helps.
Oh, yeah.
I really like diagrams.
Great idea.
It helps me figure it out, and I can just look at the picture, look at the diagram, and then move on from there. But so that's the first importance of the book of Ruth. Secondly, it demonstrates God's continual love and kindness toward Gentiles, as we already pointed out. Thirdly, it demonstrates God's love for the precious women he created. And God, make no mistake, again, as we've been kind of joking a little bit about feminism and everything, God isn't into, like our culture is, the sort of worshiping womanhood as we sort of are in our culture today. But womanhood is a good thing. Womanhood is, and this is actually the book of Ruth, is the first book of the Bible where the central theme is on the life of a woman, or rather two women, Naomi and Ruth, and God's kindness toward them after the tragedy of great loss. I think what we see is what's demonstrated in what the New Testament talks about, God's care for widows. Widows matter to him, and they have a direct link to him. He cares for orphans and widows, as James tells us, and that is shown here. But it also shows as 1 Peter 3:3-4 tells us concerning the character of godly women, quote, "Your beauty should not consist of outward things, like elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold ornaments and fine clothes. Instead, it should consist of what is inside the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very valuable in the eyes of God." So what we see is the character of what it looks like to be that sort of precious woman in the eyes of God. We see her exceeding loyalty, and where Ruth clings to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I will go, and your God will be my God," in chapter 1, verses 14-16. You see her exceeding humility as Boaz appears before her and shows her kindness. She falls on her face, chapter 2, verse 10, and bowed down to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" The humility of a exceedingly wonderful woman. And then also you see Ruth was unusually committed to God's law and blessed because of it, having joined herself to Naomi and having joined herself to Ruth, being willing to follow what the law said concerning levirate marriage, being willing to, if God had designed that she would get married to this other guy, she would have had to have done that, and it would have been something that she would have done. You also see her taking of God's provision. According to Leviticus 19:9 and 23:22, you have the freedom she had to glean from another person's field, and it was through that provision that God had that he provided for her something bigger and more, and not only for Ruth, but also Naomi, who had experienced the greatest loss in the end there. So that leads me to the last thing that I want to say theologically. It demonstrates what God can do to undo devastating loss. Here she leaves, and she has, in a sense, disobeyed. Naomi and Ruth come back. They're miserable, and by the end of the book, their circumstances are changed for the better.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be camping on Ruth for a little bit longer, probably than had originally planned, just because of the conversation we're having today. So I'm very blessed by that. I don't know. I don't want to take this book in a direction that it was never meant to go or read into the text too much, but I do feel like with Ruth, I'm starting to wonder if we don't have a really amazing picture of womanhood and manhood. I was looking in here. Who was the first gentleman she goes to? Do we have a name for him?
Talking about her husband at the very, very beginning.
Well, she goes to one gentleman, and they're like, and he was like, well, like Zach mentioned, I'll take the blessing, but I don't want to take.
He doesn't have a name.
He doesn't. Okay, so the first guy was like, well, yeah, give me all of the good, but I don't want the responsibility. Not a man. But you have Boaz, who is willing to also take on all of that. But I'm pretty sure I was trying to read here while Zach was talking, but even before he commits to her, he is doing things to actively protect.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like men, godly men, and this is, I will openly admit that this is a biased conviction that I have, so I'll throw that out there, but men protect.
Amen.
Godly men are protectors, providers. They're looking out not just for the good of somebody who is their own, but for the good of all that the Lord has given him to encounter.
Yeah.
She was not Boaz's yet.
Right.
And he was saying, do this, don't do that. Stay here, glean with these women. I've told the men not to touch you.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
He is not necessarily even taking responsibility, but he has a desire to care for and to protect all that God cares for, all that God cares about. And that is what we need to be striving for as men.
Yeah.
And let's remember that this isn't the days of the judges. So we talk about, told the men not to touch you. Sometimes we get this picture of, Old Testament Israel as people morally far better than the surrounding nations.
Right.
The book of Judges doesn't really give us that picture.
No.
Yeah. And so, you talk about Boaz saying, I've told the men not to touch you. There's a reason why he said that.
Yep, 100%.
It's not just by the way, I let these guys know that. No, these were people that 9 times out of 10 in Judges are under judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
They're doing all the things that are right in their own eyes.
Yeah. And the fact that here you have, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, yet another man who is living in a godly way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what does that imply to us who tend to say, well, here I am. It's just our culture. That's what's messing me up. And I understand that there's some truth to that, but you understand that can't be an excuse for us to be giving in to whatever the demands of the culture are, the temptations of the culture are, the character of the culture. We have, as Christians, been called out of darkness into light. We have been called out from this world to live as a special people, zealous for good works. And again, this is an example of another example of what a godly man can be in times of darkness.
And what is needed, ultimately. And I don't want to get really weird and over spiritual. I'll just say these words for lack of a better description. That God, Boaz is described as the Redeemer. And when Christ is the ultimate Redeemer, not us, not any man, regardless of how strong he is, the man, the Redeemer, Christ alone is the Redeemer. But you can see, even in our own culture, how we are just tanking because of, and I've said this before in other conversations, geared more towards, talking about political things, but how our culture is just tanking because where are all the men? Where are all the strong, godly men? Culture falls apart when we lack strong, godly men.
Amen.
So, for closing thoughts on that at all?
No. I think you got it.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. I hope it's been a blessing to our listeners. Like I said before, if you guys haven't listened to Joel, go listen to Joel. I was so encouraged by that conversation too, as I was with this one.
I came in the summer of 2022, so check that out. Go back to the one that's called Our Nation is Under Judgment, a study on Joel.
Yep. Great conversations then and now. And so thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more theologic content.